Bern Symphony. Orgone, Orgonitem, Cloudbuster, and Chembuster. An attempt at unraveling basics of responsible action. June 2011. Recently, I have been receiving more inquiries about the possible use of cloudbusters, chembusters, and orgonite in connection with combating drought related to chemtrails or the neutralization of interference fields from mobile phone masts and others. On one hand, the growing interest in these unconventional methods of environmental treatment is pleasing. On the other hand, there is a high degree of confusion and blind activism on these topics and terms on the internet. So far, I have responded to such inquiries with personal letters or conversations. Because I can no longer keep up with the replies, I will outline the aspects that seem essential to me in writing below. I hope that I may succeed in bringing a bit more clarity to these topics, while also highlighting the fundamentals of responsible action in this area. Wilhelm Reich, discoverer of the life energy orgone. The terms orgone, orgone energy, or orgone radiation, as well as the term cloudbuster, trace back to Wilhelm Reich, as does the term DOR, deadly orgone radiation. In 1938, he achieved a breakthrough in the scientific discovery of the life energy that flows through and surrounds all living organisms, and whose free flow is the basis of the natural self-regulation of living processes. He discovered a material configuration that makes it possible to concentrate this energy from space, the so-called orgone accumulator. This consists essentially of nothing more than several alternating layers of insulator and metal. Its energy condensing effect is stronger the more these alternating and touching layers of insulator and metal are present. Reich used concentrated orgone energy not only for physical experiments, but also for the bioenergetic charging of weakened organisms and for the regeneration of damaged tissue, for example in wound treatment, achieving unusual healing successes.
I remind once again how it was observed in the context of treating severely ill cancer patients, that they regained strength where they were previously completely weakened, and that they gained weight again because they regained their appetite, that the dragging pain from the tumors subsided or even disappeared entirely, so they no longer needed morphine, that the tumors even dissolved in part, or at least reduced in size, that even previously necrotic tissue, such as bone tissue where a tumor had formed, with the regression, with the reduction of the tumor, this necrotic tissue regenerated. These have all been such enormously impressive effects.
In his Orano experiment, in 1951, he was confronted with a violent reaction of highly concentrated orgone energy to radioactive radiation, not only in his lab, but also in the surroundings. He interpreted this phenomenon as an overstimulation of life energy with serious consequences for living organisms and the atmosphere, Orano effect.
1951. That was the time of the Korean War. With these insights that Reich had gained, with the discovery and utilization of orgone energy, it was such a challenge for him to test and research whether energy could possibly be used in relation to radiation sickness. Orano effect would be an agitation, a stirring up of life energy, namely in all areas where this life energy acts.
Later, he observed a shift from overexcitation to a state of energetic rigidity or paralysis, for which he coined the term DOR. While the Orano effect in the atmosphere appeared as an almost unreal, dazzling clarity with a deep blue sky, the DOR atmosphere appeared as a dull, grey haze, perceived as paralyzing over the landscape and in the sky. This experience, perceived as oppressive and threatening in the US state of Maine, Reich's residence at the time, formed the backdrop for the development of a device for bioenergetic revitalization of the atmosphere. Through the use of this device, the sky and landscape cleared up again, and structured clouds formed anew. Or when the parallel metal pipes, an essential part of the device, were aimed at one of the clouds in a cloud chain, the targeted cloud dissolved within a few minutes. This observation was the reason why Reich called this device Cloudbuster, and the use of the device later for entirely different purposes, such as cloud formation and even causing rain, was generally referred to by him as cloudbusting. Called. The cloudbuster evokes problematic associations. In that regard, the term cloudbuster was mischosen by Reich from the very beginning. He was not concerned later with the destruction of clouds, but rather the opposite, the stimulation of cloud formation. The term buster also evokes false associations, unfortunately reinforced by the device's appearance. Reich's classic cloudbuster looks at first glance like a Stalin organ, a rocket launcher used by the Soviet Army in the Second World War. Aside from this similarity in appearance, there is nothing in common between Reich's cloudbuster and the Stalin organ. The cloudbuster does not work through explosions. It has nothing to do with a projectile or a cannon, and the purpose of its use is the exact opposite, namely to stimulate disturbed living processes instead of destroying them. The cloudbuster also does not involve any energy known and used in physics and technology, such as electricity, magnetism, gravitation, combustion, chemistry, or electronics, and it operates silently. In its simplicity and effect, it rather resembles an acupuncture needle. And the word sky acupuncture comes closer to the functional principle. I now prefer to speak of sky acupuncture, because despite all differences between the human organism and the earth organism, there are functional identities regarding life energy and its disturbances. Just like an individual person can become bioenergetically ill, so can the living organism, Earth, and its life energy that flows through and around it. Both organisms can be disturbed or destroyed in their natural self-regulation and enter a state of bioenergetic overexcitation or rigidity with long-term destructive consequences. So what the bioenergetic healing process is about is the gentle restoration of natural self-regulation. The solution to the blockage is the solution, gently, not forcefully. This is the heading on my website, www.berndsenf.de. And this principle also applies in the context discussed here. That's why it's highly regrettable when terms like weather cannon or rain machine are used in connection with the Reichian cloudbuster, because problematic associations and emotions are thereby aroused, and people with correspondingly problematic motivations may potentially be attracted to this topic and drawn to related activities. In distinction from methods of weather control and weather manipulation, there are now a number of more or less forcible chemical and physical methods of weather control and weather manipulation, such as cloud seeding with silver iodide for the purpose of inducing rainfall, cloud seeding, or the generation of standing waves, even over long distances, and the local heating of Earth regions using HAARP technology, or the use of large ion generators for rainmaking, and finally, the spraying of chemicals from airplanes in connection with chemtrails. With all that, The Reichian methods have nothing in common. They work on the orgone-energetic level, whose existence is still ignored or denied by the prevailing sciences and technology, and even by the Green parties, environmental organizations, and most media. Or what holds the world together at its core and deeply moves it, the cosmic life energy, is precisely what has been banished from the patriarchal worldview of the last few millennia. Through this ignorance, the life-energetic functions in humans and nature are massively disturbed and destroyed worldwide, consciously or unconsciously, without it being a public topic so far. Or with the Reichian devices, the Orgone Accumulator and the Cloudbuster, these are not simply additional variants of technical machines, but devices that directly and immediately affect the functions of cosmic life energy. In the true sense of the word, they have an impact and operate on the bioenergetic level, even if secondary effects on the physical material level arise from this. And this energy, in the atmosphere, and even in the universe, is the same that in connection with the plasma movement in our cells forms the basis of our emotions. Individually, different reactions to concentrated life energy. This is also the reason why people, and by the way, also animals and plants, react physically and emotionally to these devices, each in their own way, depending on their individual structure of character and body armor, whose origin and significance Reich has so fundamentally explored in his therapeutic work. Or while one person, perhaps due to strong armor, doesn't initially feel anything unusual near these devices, another energetically permeable person experiences strong bodily sensations and emotions. Working on loosening one's own character and body armor and understanding one's own emotions is therefore an important component and prerequisite for the responsible application of these bioenergetically effective devices and methods. As simple as these devices look, their effects on one's own organism and the environment are profound. Careful handling of organ devices. Since this is the case, I advise anyone who wants to work with these devices or gather experiences to approach the experiences very cautiously, to begin the dosage and application at a low level, and to increase very gradually, while constantly observing the effects and after effects in one's own organism and the environment. And at the first signs of an overdose, to take a longer break. Reich had already pointed out that a prolonged stay near a working cloudbuster can cause strong physical and emotional irritations, especially when touching the metal parts with bare hands. This results in the urgent advice to keep the time spent near the device as short as possible, and, if necessary, to touch the device only with thick rubber gloves. In other words, one should maintain a distance of 10 to 20 meters from the device in operation, and if possible, operate it from this distance. It should also be ensured that other people do not stay near the device or touch it. Ignoring these instructions can lead to unpleasant surprises. Incidentally, the effect of the classic cloudbuster cannot simply be turned off by disconnecting it from the water. Instead, the effect gradually fades, even after separating the device from the water. Therefore, it is important to position the parallel pipes at a downward angle towards the ground after use, and not store the device near places where people and animals spend extended periods, so preferably far from residential and working areas. Attentive observation of the effects and after effects. For other reasons as well, It is important to handle the use of such a device with great care. The effects on the atmosphere often do not appear immediately after the start of use, and certainly not suddenly, but rather gradually build up. And it can take hours or even days until they become visible, noticeable, and measurable. At the beginning, in a dull and matte DORA atmosphere, grayish-brown streaks can form, between which more and more blue sky gradually becomes visible. This development can eventually lead to a significant clearing and radiant glow of the sky, which can still be visible long after sunset. It can also lead to refreshing winds, noticeable cooling, and the formation of white and clearly structured clouds against a deep blue sky, which can eventually condense into an overcast and increasingly dark cloud cover, leading to rain. Sometimes, and in some areas, it only takes a quarter or half an hour, with a certain handling of the device and with intense and sensitive observation of the sky and the landscape. The importance of the emotional mood and motivation, a loving commitment to nature, and the task undertaken seems to play an essential role in the effectiveness of the method. Hectic ego trips. I am the greatest, or I have the biggest, or commercial interests. I will make a lot of money with that. And other problematic attitudes seem to impair the effect and reflect negatively on the individual. They are entirely out of place in the context of this work. One should also not try to prove something to oneself or anyone else, or convince skeptics, or in any way put oneself under pressure or be pressured with the use of these devices. In my experience, even the most impressive effects will not convince the hard-nosed skeptic, but rather strengthen their defensive attitude. Observations beyond the horizon. In addition, the observer's view should not be limited to the area within the line of sight, but should extend far beyond it. The examination and evaluation of the most current possible satellite images, weather maps, or weather reports and forecasts is therefore of particular importance for the immediate and further surroundings. There are now excellent weather services on the internet, for example, www.weatheronline.de or www.wonderground.de, or under the keyword current satellite images, many others. For the work, it is very important to gradually become familiar with them, and also from this perspective to gain a deeper understanding of the weather events and their changes. Therefore, an internet connection should be accessible near the deployment site, and the corresponding satellite images, weather maps, and weather data should be stored if possible. Initially, it makes sense to take photos of the weather and landscape with a digital camera, before, during, and even several days after the operation, with the date and time displayed, and also to save them. Or you can refer to images from webcams on the internet near the deployment location, which can be found using a search engine with the keywords webcams plus the location. Storing all this is useful to allow for a clear review of the deployment and its effects, and to exchange information with others over distances. Important prerequisites for trustworthy energy work. These are already quite a number of prerequisites for responsible use of these devices and methods. Anyone who feels deterred by this should better leave it alone for now. Under no circumstances should the devices be used like a big toy to play around with at one's own discretion to appear interesting to others, possibly unaware of what can be caused by it. It should only be used in crisis situations. For example, in the case of a prolonged and impending drought, when there is a lifeless appearing DORA atmosphere spanning several days or weeks, or with a heavily overcast sky. In areas with a decades-long usual cycle of rainy and dry seasons, one should not work against the rhythm of nature, meaning not during the usual dry seasons, but rather at the beginning of the formerly usual rainy seasons, if the renewed absence of rain becomes apparent. Move with nature, not against it. This sentence by Victor Schauberger also applies in this context. James DeMeo, who has extensive experience with the use of the Reichian Cloudbuster, also in drought-fighting projects, published a longer article titled "So, You Want to Build a Cloudbuster?" about 20 years ago. In it, he strongly warned against a careless and ignorant use of these devices. And these warnings are still to be taken absolutely seriously today. Own experiences with bioenergetic drought control. I myself participated in several projects by James DeMeo and was able to witness the almost unbelievable and impressive effects of his work. For example, in Namibia in 1993 and in Eritrea in 1994. In both countries, it was possible to overcome a devastating drought using these methods. Contrary to all predictions, abundant rainfall occurred, and nature was able to recover. I visited both countries again a few years later, and the previously completely parched landscape was transformed. Everything had turned green again. Previously dried lakes and rivers were abundantly filled with water, and the wildlife populations, heavily reduced by drought, had regenerated. In my book, The Rediscovery of the Living, I have reported on this extensively. On my website, under the section Integral Environmental Healing, you can find many articles about the work of James DeMeo. The Project Orop Israel, 1991, and the Project Orop Eritrea, 1994 to 1999, were thoroughly documented by DeMeo himself, the latter in his journal Heretic's Notebook. With the exception of Eritrea, where the government at the time showed a certain openness to these methods and supported the project in a modest capacity over several years, there was no positive response or reaction from official bodies or established scientists. In Eritrea, there was instead a hostile and completely unfounded attack by an American guest professor, culminating in the thesis that DeMeo and his team were New Age imperialists, trying to swindle third world countries out of their money with their charlatanry. Launched in 2003, the project Desert Greening through Integral Environmental Healing in Algeria, www.desertgreening.com, has furthermore demonstrated that the combined use of bioenergetic methods to revitalize the atmosphere, soil, water, and plants can achieve nearly unbelievable results. In a few years, desert at the northern edge of the Sahara has transformed into fertile land. This project was significantly inspired, by the way, by Majid Abd el-Aziz's participation. He is the founder and head of this project. In my lecture series on Wilhelm Reich in Berlin, which was posted online on 16 3-hour DVDs, as well as by my book, The Rediscovery of the Living. Orgonite and Chembuster. Cloudbuster after Don Croft. For about 10 years, more and more people on the internet have been talking about Don Croft from the USA, who purported himself to be a great admirer and expert on Wilhelm Reich. He claimed to have further developed and improved Reich's devices and methods to, above all, he emphasized that the variants developed by him, unlike those of Reich, can be used by anyone without any relevant prior knowledge or experience, and would only have a healing effect on humans, animals, plants, the soil, the waters, and the atmosphere. Furthermore, they are also easy and cheap to make yourself. Corresponding building instructions were and are being circulated on the internet. For example, at www.gandhiauftrag.de chembuster.pdf. One variant related to the accumulation of orgone energy and the simultaneous alleged neutralization of disruptive fields, or the transformation of DOR into orgone through a specific material combination he called orgonite. In German, it was translated as orgonet, or the other variant was somewhat based on the Reichian cloudbuster, but with significant modification of its construction and functionality. The impairment of the healing effects of concentrated orgone energy by radioactivity, disruption fields, and DOR atmosphere, as described by James DeMeo in his Orgone Accumulator Handbook, should be transformed into life-positive energy by the orgonite, for example, in a cone shape. This should be achieved through the special combination of materials consisting of metal shavings surrounded by casting resin and rock crystals. Doncroft's Holy Hand Grenade, HHG. The cone-shaped structure was given the name Holy Hand Grenade, HHG, which translates into German as Heiliger Handgranit, means. I must confess that this militant language repelled me from the beginning. To me, it sounds like a call to a holy war, and that with methods that are supposedly based on the terms and supposed foundations of Wilhelm Reich. In a conversation with Georg Ritschl, a very committed activist of the Doncroft movement from South Africa, during a congress in 2005 in Bregenz, he told me the term Holy Hand Grenade was only meant as a joke. But I cannot laugh about this kind of humor. Such terms tend to attract people with a certain propensity for violence, who need a clearly defined enemy image to act out. And this is exactly what Doncroft and Georg Ritschl provided at www.organizeafrica.com. It is the ruling and behind-the-scenes world elite of secret societies, which, among other things, wants to poison and exterminate large parts of the world's population with chemtrails to get closer to their goal of a new world order. Overcoming structures of domination without violence. Now indeed, there are, also according to my findings, highly questionable power structures behind the scenes of official world events, such as the Bilderbergers. Nevertheless, I consider it very problematic to want to oppose these powers and powerful people with something violent, even just in language and thoughts. Violent terms all too easily attract fanatics prone to violence. And I want nothing to do with fanatics of any kind, especially not in connection with the highly sensitive life energy and its application. Gently, not violently, the blockages should be resolved wherever life energy is involved. Otherwise, the supposed liberation from domination turns into even greater rigidity, stagnation, and counter-violence in the individual, in society, and in nature. That this is a general functional principle, Reich has impressively worked out. To disregard this, and at the same time cite Reich, as I observe, in part, in the chembuster scene, this does not contribute to the appreciation of Reich, but rather to his distortion. James DeMeo's criticism of the Doncroft movement. That James DeMeo, who worked for decades on the processing of Reich's work and the experimental verification of his research, felt provoked simply by the association of the Holy Hand Grenade with Reich's name is entirely understandable. When Doncroft also proclaimed an improved device for himself in the field of energetic weather work, in which DeMeo had long-standing experience, calling it the chembuster and promoting its widespread use, De Meo felt compelled to openly criticize it.
This led to a controversy between him and Don Croft, or rather, the Cambuster scene, which resulted in a significant hardening of positions. I myself find myself caught between the two sides in this controversy, and I can partly appreciate aspects of both sides. However, I also have fundamental reservations about both sides. Croft's Orgonite and Reich's Orgon Accumulator ORAC. First, I want to address Orgonite, which, by the way, is not only cast in the form of cones, but now also comes in all possible other shapes, designs and sizes. In the form of a cylinder, it also forms the base of the Chembuster, with some additions. James De Meo thinks that these Orgonite bodies have nothing to do with the Reich Orgone accumulator, and also doubts their energy accumulating and healing effects. The term Orgonite, clearly modeled after the Reichian term Orgone, is nonsense and misleading insofar as it also associates Reich's name with the chaotic scene around Don Croft, and thus harms the Reichian work. I see this somewhat differently. The essential for the effect of an Orgone accumulator given up. ORAC are alternating layers of insulator and metal, with which in some variants, like the large box accumulator, a space is enclosed. In other variants, such as the Orgon pillow or the Orgon blanket, it remains simply alternating layers of insulator and metal. The accumulating effect is stronger the more alternating layers are used. Various versions of the Orgon accumulator and their construction are described in some of my articles in Emotion and also in my book The Rediscovery of the Living. A variant I developed, the ORAC tube, even forms the bridge between Orgone research and Chinese acupuncture, which I called Orgone Acupuncture and presented at the World Congress for Acupuncture in 1976 in Berlin. The decisive factor for the accumulating effect of the ORAC seems to be that there are interfaces between the insulator and metal. However, they also exist when metal shavings are embedded in resin and surrounded by it, as is the case with Orgonite. Reich himself, by the way, already had a similar idea when he mixed sand with iron filings in a test tube and used the resulting accumulator for organ irradiation of the oral cavity or teeth. For the accumulation effect, insulator and metal probably do not need to meet as relatively smooth and flat surfaces, but can also be mixed together. Under these conditions as well, interfaces between the two materials are formed. For me, an Orgonite body in the simple mixture of metal shavings and casting resin is just another variant of an Orgon accumulator. It would therefore be mistaken to deny the Orgone irradiation effect of this variant, just because it looks different from the previously known variants. Even in other areas, technical development did not stop at the first prototype, for example, with the car or the computer. Both look completely different today than they did at their respective beginnings and also fulfill additional functions. Why should the development of organ devices remain at the initial stage? The use of aluminum for organ construction is discouraged. However, Reich had indications that different metals in the construction of the ORAC result in different qualities of concentrated orgone energy. For example, he warned against the use of aluminum in this context because harmful toxic effects were exerted on the human organism. Unlike the use of iron or steel, steel wool, or galvanized steel, ORACs based on iron and steel have proven to be the best for use in humans so far, which does not exclude the possibility that there are even better materials for this purpose, such as gold and silver. The sarcophagi in ancient Egypt seem, for example, to have been multi-layered orgone accumulators based on gold, which were also adapted to the body shape of the pharaoh, thereby possibly having an even stronger effect, whatever the purpose may have been. Whether other metals potentially used for orgone accumulators can also contribute to the beneficial effects of concentrated orgone energy can only be determined by experience, or by testing with pendulums, divining rods, or other energetic test methods. Could aluminum also be harmful in orgonite? In any case, the warning about the toxic effects of aluminum in orgone construction did not prevent Don Croft from using it to produce orgonite bodies, which I find problematic. Instead, I would advise initially using only iron or steel shavings when casting orgonite bodies and gaining experience with that. Later, for comparison, you could perhaps use only copper shavings and compare the effects of the different orgonites. Compare. In my opinion, there has been far too little comparative research conducted on this aspect so far. Especially those who possess a pronounced sensitivity to energy should contribute this to systematic research of this kind. Perhaps there are even individual differences in tolerance concerning various metals and different insulators. To not pay attention to the different effects of the materials and to not provide any indication of this, I consider negligent. In the orgonite scene, as far as I know, it is simply recommended and practiced to use any kind of metal shavings, regardless of their potentially different effects. Additions with crystals now, there's another component added to the orgonite body, namely rock crystals. Although this does not happen in reference to Reich, it can still be meaningful if empirical knowledge regarding various crystals and stones is taken seriously and included in the construction of orgone accumulators or orgonites. By the way, a combination of aurex and crystals was developed independently of Don Croft by Jürgen Fischer, www.orgon.de, who has built and sold many orgone accumulators of various sizes, strengths and designs over several decades. Among them is what he calls the Angel Accumulator, a combination of classic auroch with rose quartz, which is said to have a kind of cleansing effect on the energy field affected by Dor and other disruptive fields, and can also supposedly open subtle channels of spiritual perception. Addition with spiral. Sometimes copper spirals are also integrated into orgonite bodies, which for me makes sense referencing Victor Schauberger and Reich, because the spiral represents the basic form of movement of the cosmic life energy. It can contribute to the fact that the life energy whirls into a specific medium, such as water, air, or cast resin, condenses in this way, and contributes to a self-cleaning of the respective medium. Such self-cleaning effects are known from swirling water and swirling air during tornadoes. Why shouldn't such experiences also be considered and integrated when constructing orgone devices? In this respect, Don Croft may have created an ingeniously simple integration of various experiential knowledge of life energy with his orgonite bodies and a further development of the Reichian orgone accumulator. Attacking him just because this variant deviates somewhat from the Reich original, I consider unjustified. My criticism of Don Croft and parts of the orgonite scene focuses on other points. I have already hinted at two of them. Calling certain orgonite products holy hand grenade and using random metal shavings, including aluminum. Whether the negative effect of aluminum in orgonite construction is neutralized or even transformed into a life-positive quality through the integration of quartz crystals and copper spirals cannot be ruled out from the outset. Only experience and systematic comparisons between orgonite bodies with different metals using appropriate bioenergetic testing methods can show that. The dogma of absolute salvation. Even if the orgonite body were to concentrate and emit a purified quality of orgon energy, I consider the thesis of Doncroft, Georg Ritschl, and large parts of the orgonite scene to be problematic, that it would only have positive effects on humans, animals, plants, soil, water, and air. I call it the dogma of absolute salvation. It reminds me of the structure of some cults, for whom there is only one sole salvific path or leader or god. Except that the paths of different cults and religions often fundamentally differ from each other, and their followers often fanatically fight each other. Such a dogma makes the rest of the world all too easily appear as a threat and enemy, and diving into such an enemy image can truly provoke and reinforce hostile reactions, thus seemingly confirming one's own worldview repeatedly. One should avoid getting drawn into such patterns in the first place, and if it happens, recognize and break free from them as soon as possible. At least that's what my life experience and orientation tell me. For the effectiveness of life energetic methods and in other areas, experience counts. It depends on the dosage. Too much of a good thing can turn into the opposite, especially regarding life energetic charging. Even when the quality of energy in well-measured doses is healing, an excess of energetic charging can lead to very unpleasant and threatening overload symptoms, varying according to the individual structure of the character and body armor and the bioenergetic charge of the whole organism or the blood. I have some evidence from people who experienced physical and emotional irritation near orgonite objects or chembusters. The danger seems to me to be especially great in people with a pronounced schizoid component in their character structure, which is accompanied by a strong armoring of the upper head and eyes, while simultaneously having an unusual energetic permeability in other areas of the organism. See my lecture, Eye Blocking and Schizophrenia, Origin and Treatment. The denial of possible dangers in the orgonite scene, in my impression, lacks any indications of such possible dangers so far. I also have my doubts that the activists in this field, including Doncroft and Georg Ritschl, are even aware of these important insights of Wilhelm Reich about character and body armor. It is to be hoped that this knowledge will also be processed and taken seriously within the orgonite scene to avoid a careless handling of orgonite products. A further problem I see with the orgonite products is that, unlike the rich ORAC and its various variants presented by me, 2001, if necessary, cannot be disassembled into their individual parts again, unless they are smashed with a hammer. And even this possibility is no longer available once they have been deposited or sunk somewhere in the landscape or in bodies of water for the purpose of environmental healing and cannot be retrieved. Would absolutely only good healing and life-positive energies emanate from the orgonite products? In any dosage, forever, everywhere, and under all circumstances. Then there would be nothing against it in terms of reviving nature. But what if there are justified doubts about this dogma of the orgonite and chembuster scene? What interactions, for example, arise between orgonite and radioactivity? Perhaps similarly dramatic as Reich experienced and discovered in his Oranor experiment when radioactivity met highly concentrated orgon energy. I am not aware of such questions being discussed in the orgonite scene, let alone corresponding hypotheses being experimentally researched and disproven. Should orgonite products react to radioactivity similarly to a strong ORAC? then it would be urgently necessary to avoid the encounter of radioactivity and orgonite. And where it cannot be avoided, such as in sudden nuclear disasters like Chernobyl and Fukushima, then the orgonite products must be quickly dismantled into their individual parts, so that the accumulating effect and the Oranur effect can subside again. When I addressed Georg Ritschl about these possible dangers in 1995, he didn't even know what the Oranur effect meant. Until then, he hadn't heard or read anything about the Oranur experiment at all. And even years later, I had the impression from his website www.organizeafrica.com that he had not taken these serious suggestions into account or considered them in any way in his activities. On the contrary, gifting the campaign of the Etheric Warriors, Georg Ritschl, like Don Croft, continued to promote that as many orgonite products as possible, in the form of cones, pyramids or muffins, small cakes, should be scattered across the landscape as a healing and wholesome gift. In English, a gift to Mother Earth. A growing movement has formed worldwide from this call, communicated via the Internet, which is presented among other places on the website ethericwarriors.com, German for Etheric Warriors, where activists also exchange their related experiences with each other. Here again, a militant language appears and presumably a corresponding mindset. And once more, reference is made to Wilhelm Reich, who is once again placed in a negative light in this way. Georg Ritschl himself has conducted several such actions or expeditions of gifting on water and on land, especially in southern Africa. In the year 2009, he, together with some other activists, initially threw large quantities of orgonite products into the Cabora Bassa reservoir in Mozambique from an inflatable boat. After their engine failed, they continued their action from a public ferry, where they aroused the suspicion of fellow passengers. Eventually, they were arrested by the police and placed in pre-trial detention on suspicion of a crime, which was also reported in German media, to a large extent with scorn and ridicule, which was then also extended to Wilhelm Reich, because upon closer examination of the orgonite products, nothing threatening could be detected, only casting resin and metal shavings, and nothing else suspicious was found with the activists. They were released after a few weeks from their rather intolerable detention conditions. Other activists are currently engaged in carrying out gifting actions, among other things, at Lake Victoria in East Africa, with the knowledge of Don Croft, as noted on the website. Overall, I find the careless handling of the orgonite products and ignoring possible disposal issues very problematic, because it cannot be fundamentally ruled out that they may have negative and burdensome effects on humans and the environment. For example, through the use of harmful metals, overdosing, or interactions with other substances or radiations. Anyone who dismisses any, even well-intentioned criticism from the outset is in danger of becoming dogmatic or even fanatical. Chembuster, Cloudbuster, according to Don Croft. Everything said above about the orgonite products equally applies to the Chembuster developed by Don Croft. Misleadingly, this device is now often also called a cloudbuster, creating the false impression that it is essentially the same device as the classic Reich Cloudbuster, or even identical to it. When I'm asked about the Cloudbuster, I always respond with a counter-question. Which Cloudbuster do you mean? The classic one by Reich, or the Chembuster by Don Croft? The Chembuster, for which detailed building instructions are available on the internet and which is also offered by many suppliers as a kit or in finished form for sale. for example at www.organizeafrica.com, consists, as previously explained, from an orgonite base with some additions, such as the embedded short copper tubes, the mountain crystals wrapped with copper spirals and a large copper spiral. Finally, longer parallel copper pipes are placed on the short copper pipes. As another addition, there is sometimes the so-called sapper, a vibration generator, which is otherwise used in the field of vibrational and informational medicine, which is a separate area outside of conventional medicine. Gembuster against chemtrails. The background for the development and use of chembusters by Don Croft and a now very large number of followers and users are the so-called chemtrails. These are trails left by airplanes in the sky which do not dissipate after a few minutes and at a certain distance from the airplane, but instead spread wider and diffusely obscure the affected area of the sky. When several such trails, for example, parallel or crisscrossing the sky appear, an initially clear and deep blue sky can become increasingly cloudy and obscured in a few hours, and the initially clear colors in the landscape give way to an increasing dullness. The internet is full of corresponding photos and videos under the keyword chemtrails from large parts of the world. Chemtrails, a worrying phenomenon. Like many other people, I have been observing this phenomenon with growing concern for several years. Beyond what I had already noticed regarding the energetic stagnation of the atmosphere, which started shortly after Chernobyl and then spread over Europe and other parts of the world, brought these streaks in the sky an obvious additional burden, paralysis, and lifelessness into the atmosphere and over the landscape. So it was an additional disturbance and destruction of atmospheric orgone energy, another aspect of the bioenergetic illness of the Earth.
I say from space seen in the year 2000 and here in the year 2015. Hopefully you can see the difference. I don't know if it is visually noticeable. We have a bit too much light here, but in the last 15 years this program has increased tremendously. It is 42 countries, almost finely dusted particles that are sprayed by tanker jets for this geoengineering, it is said, weather modification and climate modification. And then he addresses what is contained in all of that. And then here below, then in the abstract, the consequences for public health are far-reaching, including exposure to heavy metals, radioactive elements, and this aluminum that I keep emphasizing. At this point, I want to say that the theolith here has an incredible significance in removing these substances from us.
This was one of the biggest volcanic explosions in history. It happened on June 15, 1991 in the northwest of the Philippines. But the cloud itself did something extraordinary. It lowered the Earth's temperature for 4 years. Sulfur dioxide in the cloud created particles which spread around the Earth. These then reflected some of the sun's rays into space. Scientists are looking to mimic the effects of this phenomenon to counter global warming. It's a highly controversial concept known as solar geoengineering. In the past 25 years, the global average temperature has risen by around 0.5 degrees Celsius.
The accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere is warming the Earth up, causing more intense hurricanes, rains, and higher temperatures.
The Paris Agreement, signed by 175 parties in 2016, was a sign that countries were willing to work together to cut emissions. But not every world leader is on board.
The Paris Climate Accord is simply the latest example of Washington entering into an agreement that disadvantages the United States.
To have a global effect, you're going to need all governments on board. It's actually potentially incredibly simple because all you need to do is inject a bunch of particles into the stratosphere, and there's a number of ways you could do that. Recently, a study out of Yale and Harvard looked at the details of how this would be done.
In that Harvard and Yale study, they imagined building a fleet of planes, up to 95 of them, that would make 60,000 flights a year. The fleet would spread hundreds of thousands of tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere every year. After 15 years, they reckon the world would cool by 0.3 degrees Celsius. Not enough is known about how it could impact the climate or the chemistry of the atmosphere. There could be unexpected consequences.
You can affect rain patterns, and you might cause a region that is already suffering from drought to have even less water.
You could actually spray sulfuric acid in the stratosphere 20 kilometers over our head, and use that to stop the planet warming up in a kind of ugly tech
No, wait. You can spray something into the atmosphere to
spray pollution into the atmosphere to stop it warming. And you start with a fleet of modified business jets and say 20,000 tons of sulfuric acid into the stratosphere every year. And each year you have to put a little more. You put 50 million tons of sulfuric acid in the air now as pollution, and it kills 1 million people a year worldwide.
Okay, but it'll be better if we put more
We're talking about 1% of that.
1% more, we're just killing 10,000 more people. What happens to the sulfuric acid after it's sprayed? Does it just stay up there?
No, it rains down, but it's a tiny addition.
Weil was wären die Auswirkungen dieser Materialien auf die menschliche Gesundheit, wenn sie in die Stratosphäre gelangten, insbesondere kleine Aluminiumpartikel?
Nicht einmal im entferntesten ein.
Let me clarify. So 10 megatons of aluminum dumped into the atmosphere would have no human health impact?
So let me be more careful here. We haven't done anything serious on alumina, and so there could be something terrible that we'll find tomorrow we haven't looked at. And then that actually means we should be more serious about the risks of CO2 in the atmosphere. And by the way, it's not really a moral hazard, it's more like free riding on our grandkids.
That's the airspace above Germany as American jurisdiction. We come to talking revolution, but it's about the origin of aluminum that is not immune from us. It's about the trails left behind the planes. Those are aluminum compounds in the sky, a metal blanket. Okay, if it's true and above. Aluminum is showered down on us, then we financed measurements to rain. And here on top you can see the value in the USA, 0.5 micrograms per liter. The rain reaches over 2,000 times above this value. The most important is the aluminum in all blood vessels that cause inflammation. All of Europe is being injected. Here is an article published on the topic. What is being injected, or what is most harmful to us humans, are tiny microscopic fiberglass beads that are coated with aluminum and that we inhale. Here once again the connection between glyphosate and aluminum work magically together and are the real cause of depression, dementia, anxiety, behavior, Parkinson's disease, and naturally autism. One could, if one were malicious. If I want to bring humanity to its knees, then I would spray your food with glyphosate. I would pollute the air with aluminum. And if that is still not enough, I would add a bit more aluminum to the vaccines. This way I could make you all stupid and extinct over 2 or 3 generations. What I also need for this are certain electromagnetic frequencies. I need those to disable your detoxification enzymes. Disable. And exactly these frequencies come through the cell phone transmission function. If I were malicious, I would say behind it all must be an intelligent group of evil scientists and politicians behind it. But since I am not malicious, I assume these are just coincidences.
Aluminum does not have a single natural function in the body. Nevertheless, it enters the human body through the lungs, through the skin, and with food through the intestines. Researchers have found it in the bones, in the muscles, in the liver, in the brain, and even in the hair. It can accumulate in the bones over years. It becomes dangerous in the case of aluminum poisoning. Then it disrupts the mineralization of the bone. It becomes soft. Or for another tissue, aluminum can be dangerous. The brain. Once in the brain, aluminum can bind to the cell membrane of neurons and disrupt signal transmission. Additionally, there are indications that aluminum promotes the formation of free radicals. These can attack and destroy neurons, cells. The concern that more and more aluminum accumulates in the brain over the years. But the aluminum can also attach to other places where it doesn't belong. It attaches to the receptor of the female sex hormone estrogen. This is why aluminum is also referred to by some researchers today as the metal estrogen.
Similar to plastic, aluminum is a material that we can hardly escape in our everyday life. The lightweight metal is found mainly in cosmetics and in our food. But aluminum threatens our health, and many people in Germany consume too much of it. The Federal Institute for Risk Assessment has now issued a warning. According to it, we should urgently reduce the intake of aluminum, and this can have fatal consequences for our health. This is shown in a recent study by the Federal Institute for Risk Assessment, BFR, where for the first time the total intake of aluminum through the skin and mouth evaluated for health. The solubility of aluminum is increased by salt and acid. A high intake of aluminum compounds can cause developmental disorders of the brain and motor skills, as well as cause damage to kidneys, liver and bones. Aluminum compounds can trigger inflammatory effects or oxidative stress in cells, damaging them. Additionally, the cell's metabolism is affected and the cells can no longer adequately supply themselves with energy, leading to cell death.
By the way, the term chemtrails comes from the chemical substances. In contrast to the normal condensation trails, which are called contrails in English, the official denial of chemtrails by authorities. Government agencies, political parties, environmental organizations, meteorologists continue to either ignore the phenomenon of chemtrails or deny it in response to corresponding inquiries. And the media have so far almost universally adhered to this silence cartel.
In life, there is always a basic level of village idiots in every place. The problem today is simply that they know each other and can spread their nonsense further on the internet.
What Cashelman refers to as nonsense are, for Werner Alt, concrete evidence. So-called chembusters, stationed on the ground, are supposed to drive away the toxic clouds. How exactly that works remains mysterious. Plastic buckets, copper pipes and liquid resin are the main components of the wonder weapon for the front yard, as can be learned from the internet. The sky over Germany. It offers plenty of space for trails and even more for obscure speculations. Nevertheless, it has now become known that even before the appearance of chemtrails, there was already a patent, the Welsbach patent, which included the spraying of certain fine particles into the atmosphere. The purpose of the exercise is to build a global shield to reflect sunlight on Earth in order to counteract the alleged global warming. Additionally, it became known that there was an international conference on the topic of geoengineering, where the use of this method was seriously discussed. By the way, you just need to open your eyes and look at the sky whenever you get the chance. In Europe, you'll often see the spreading trails.
Here in the south, it's just snow. And then we have something that we cannot identify as rain or snow. Here in the west, these zigzag lines. Probably a few airplanes, military planes, brought that out over the North Sea in the afternoon. And at an altitude of about 5 to 6 kilometers, it has nothing to do with weather.
In addition to cloud holes, airplanes have a significantly larger impact on our weather, or rather on our climate, namely through contrails. Sometimes they are visible in the sky for hours. They block sunlight but also allow less heat to escape back into space. During the day, this effect balances out, but at night, the warming. The many contrails, which can be clearly seen in the satellite image, warm the atmosphere like a protective blanket. Newer studies even suggest that this effect on global warming is greater than the effect caused by the CO2 emissions from airplanes.
Clouds formed from contrails will have 3 times as strong an impact on the climate in the year 2050 as they did in 2006. Researchers from the German Aerospace Center write this in the journal Atmospheric Chemistry and Physics. The main cause is said to be the increase in air traffic. The contrails and the cirrus clouds that form from them affect the Earth's energy balance and, according to the article, contribute to warming. Such cirrus clouds have contributed more to climate warming since the beginning of aviation than the CO2 emissions from airplanes. As early as 2005, the overall effects from aviation accounted for about 5% of the worldwide human-induced warming.
Control it, set it up according to their ideas. The new trend is to use technical means for this, and they look like this.
Airplanes, for example, are supposed to bring sulfur into the upper atmosphere. The sulfur powder is mixed with the kerosene, and during combustion in the engines, sulfur dioxide is then produced.
According to the official version, these are completely normal contrails left by airplanes at certain altitudes and weather conditions in the sky. Any further interpretations are pure conspiracy theories. The wall of silence and denial is beginning to crumble. As far as the media is concerned, there is at least one commendable exception that has broken the silence. A broadcast by NTV titled HAARP and Chemtrails from the 4th of February 2011.
Humanity is on a mission. It wants to play God and control the weather. Lightning, rain, and storms are to be used as weapons.
No weapon would be used. No one would know that you started the war.
Is it possible that there have already been attacks using weather weapons? There are rumors that Katrina was a weather weapon. But how is it possible to control the weather? Earthquakes and tidal waves are the weapons of the future. We show how the impossible becomes possible and what that means for our future. If an enemy changes the jet stream over North America, it would trigger an ice age there.
An open letter from lawyer Dominic Storr to Chancellor Angela Merkel on behalf of a citizens' initiative, Clean Sky, may help to make the subject of chemtrails more and more a public and political issue, which I personally consider absolutely necessary. The Denial of Chemtrails by James DeMeo. In view of the increasingly widespread and apparently systematically conducted sky obscuration by chemtrails in large parts of the world, I am somewhat perplexed by the fact that even James DeMeo has been denying the distinctiveness of chemtrails compared to conventional contrails for years, and accuses chemtrail critics of being conspiracy theorists or victims of such theories themselves. In a similar way, he deals with people who fundamentally question the official version of September 11, 2001. Although by now there are more than enough reasons and justifications to doubt it, as the video loose change demonstrates. With this position, DeMeo leaned very far out many years ago and, to my knowledge, has not moved away from it to this day, even though the phenomena are becoming more distressing and the evidence of chemtrail pollution increasingly overwhelming. Here and there, he pointed out that some photos are forgeries or computer-manipulated photo montages or demonstrable misinterpretations. But such things are also known from other contexts, like the discussion on crop circles or UFOs. Drawing the false conclusion of generalization from this and denying all related phenomena or labeling them as deception or fraud, I find very questionable. Hardened front between the Demio and Chembuster scenes. In any case, the fronts between the Demio and Chembuster scenes have become very hardened. And both sides certainly bear their share of responsibility. Thus, the chances of being heard with constructive suggestions or warnings from the other side are lost. In my impression, as a result, correct and important warnings from Demio about the ignorant and careless use of Chembusters have largely bounced off and been ignored by the Chembuster scene. A situation that is quite deadlocked and difficult to unravel. I will still try to contribute to it. Attempt at untangling. The Chembuster was named as such by Don Croft because its use was intended to dissolve or destroy chemtrails. And the chemtrails were interpreted as something threatening to health and the environment. Not to mention that they spoil the beauty of the clear sky and the clear landscape. The fact that it is built differently and looks different from the classic Reichian Cloudbuster does not mean that it is therefore ineffective. In my understanding, it also affects the atmospheric orgone energy, but in a different way. Different functioning of the Reich Cloudbuster and Chembuster. The classic Cloudbuster, when activated by connecting with water, creates, to my understanding, an energy suction towards the water, which continues in the direction of the parallel metal pipes in the atmosphere, and in this way contributes to transforming stagnant energy into flowing living energy. Dior into orgone, similar to how frozen water, ice, transforms into flowing water when it thaws. The Chembuster, on the other hand, generates a concentrated flow of orgone out of the openings of the metal tubes in the direction the metal tubes point. So when oriented vertically towards the zenith, the experiences with the classic Cloudbuster show that the stimulation of atmospheric orgone energy and its effect can spread over greater distances, even beyond the visual horizon, clarifying and forming clouds. Accordingly, it is conceivable for me, and seems to be confirmed by many experiences, that the stimulating effect of the Chembuster on atmospheric energy, when directed towards the zenith, can affect higher layers of the atmosphere, including altitudes where airplanes fly and leave chemtrails. One time it is a bundled energy suction. Another time it is the sending of a bundled energy beam, which stimulates the orgone energetic revitalization of the atmosphere. Just like in traditional Chinese acupuncture, where silver needles are used on people for sedation through energy drainage, and gold needles are inserted for toning through energy inflow at the corresponding sedation or toning points. Two differently acting instruments could also be used in sky acupuncture. I can certainly imagine a careful and sensible use of the Chembuster under the conditions already mentioned above, if it is used well dosed, and that also means limited in time. And after use, the pipes are detached from the base again. This separation cannot stop the accumulation of energy by the orgonite base, but it can prevent the focused and directed radiation of concentrated energy. Possible risks and side effects of the Chembuster. Simply laying down the Chembuster would indeed interrupt further effects towards the zenith, but not the directed radiation itself. Based on my understanding of the connections, it would be strongly advised against, because the effects in a horizontal direction could unintentionally and unknowingly spread further into the neighborhood and surroundings, possibly producing different effects depending on the direction. Furthermore, I also consider it very problematic to set up chembusters in any orientation inside enclosed spaces. When oriented vertically, its effects could also penetrate through the ceiling, across several floors, and influence the residents on the floors above, for example, by causing them restless days and nights due to energetic overload. If one takes the experiences seriously that chembusters can dissolve chemtrails in the sky over thousands of meters, then one should not rule out that they can have significant energetic effects through several floors, unfold, and not always for the best of everyone. Because each human organism reacts differently due to the varying structures of character and body armor, and because it can lead to symptoms of overload, and that this energy also radiates through all matter and is only somewhat slowed in its spread by walls and shields. Reich demonstrated in his foundational orbophysical research, particularly in his Oura-Nur experiment, against the uninformed distribution and use of chembusters. Don Croft considers it a great advantage of the chembuster that the sometimes health-impacting effects of Reich's cloudbuster and the various prerequisites for its responsible use do not apply to the chembuster. Everyone can use it without any special prior knowledge or experience, and thus contribute to the healing of humans and nature, or make their contribution in the fight against the dark forces on Earth and beyond. Many people are now attracted to it. Some seek healing, others want to go into battle against a clearly defined enemy. Etheric warriors and holy hand grenade. How nice it is for both if they don't have to delve deeply into the basics of life energy research, or even experience this energy firsthand. But a strong warning is issued against a careless and reckless use of these energetically effective devices and methods. And this is especially important the more it affects not only one's own body, but also others, and the environment. One cannot responsibly pilot an airplane without prior knowledge and appropriate experience. It requires thorough training. In the present context, it is not only about handling a machine, but about influencing an energy that underlies our emotions and other living natural processes and can profoundly move us. It involves cosmic life energy, because we as humanity have been separated and uprooted from the original connection with this energy within us through several millennia of patriarchal violence and domination. And this pain of separation is deeply buried and suppressed within us. And because the rapid breaking of these armors would not be bearable, we can only gently approach what has been buried and allow it to unfold more and more. Caution and carefulness also with the Reich Cloudbuster. Particular and even greater caution is required regarding the use of the classic Reichian Cloudbuster. It greatly concerns me when such devices are used blindly and ignorantly without the necessary prerequisites. Even if it is only within the context of art installations, as Christoph Keller has presented multiple times. In his related art exhibitions, visitors have the opportunity to operate the Cloudbuster without any prior knowledge and direct it at any direction in the sky. The only thing that comes to my mind is, for they know not what they do. This also applies to the clueless use of Cloudbusters outside of art exhibitions, which, in my impression, has been increasing more and more in recent years. What can happen if one handles these devices thoughtlessly and ignorantly? The reactions of the atmosphere, for example, can become too intense, possibly leading to severe weather. Or the effect of the chembuster might be that not only chemtrails are dispersed, but also clouds. If the devices remain in continuous use, drought tendencies might even emerge or be intensified. James DeMeo has evidence for this, including from Namibia, where several farmers had set up chembusters, and the drought that had already been overcome intensified again. Only when they followed his advice to dismantle and take apart the chembusters did clouds reportedly form again and rain fall. DeMeo thus generally calls the chembusters cloud killers. I personally consider the indication of possible connections between chembusters and drought to be appropriate, but not in an absolute and generalized way. It likely depends on the dosage and the initial energetic situation. Different effects of chembusters on Oranur and Dor. For example, it could be that the chembusters in an Oranur atmosphere, with their continuous stimulation of atmospheric energy, further amplify the Oranur effect, thereby inhibiting cloud formation. In an energetically stagnant Dor atmosphere, however, they could have different effects. For example, an energetic stimulation, a clearing up, cloud formation, and even precipitation. But even if such effects are observed, it is advised against leaving the devices in place permanently and continuously. As mentioned, too much of a good thing can backfire. Something similar is known from human feelings, which are based on the same energy. A gentle and loving touch from a beloved person at the right moment can evoke wonderful feelings. Constant fiddling at the wrong time, on the other hand, can cause reluctance and aversion. Even in acupuncture treatment, no one would think of inserting as many acupuncture needles as possible and leaving them permanently in the body. The art of treatment consists rather in stimulating a process of self-healing, with as few needles as possible at the right points at the right time, and with an appropriate and limited treatment duration. To find the appropriate measure in the energetic treatment of the sky or the atmosphere, it requires intensive observation within the line of sight and with satellite images and weather reports beyond the horizon. An emotional and loving connection to natural events should also be added in relation to this work, alongside a dedication to the responsible task. Love, work, and knowledge are the sources of our life. They should also determine it. Wilhelm Reich.